Imagine, if you would, a scenario. It's 1998, you're a young boy, looking through the PlayStation section of games at Blockbuster. Okay, I think I've already lost like 80% of you. Then imagine you're watching the good seasons of Stranger Things, and Lucas is doing the thing I described. Scanning through the list of games, flick past Final Fantasy VII, that's so last year. And Tactics Ogre, we've already rented that 6 times and no one in the house has beaten it yet. Then pass over Ephemeral Fantasia because it wouldn't even come out for another 2 years on a console that didn't exist yet, until we finally see this curious green cover art, with a dragon stamped at the top. This was my first introduction to a niche little monster battler called Dragonseeds. All one word. And that was enough for me and my brothers to go ahead and rent the game several times over, until we'd squeezed every bit of life we could out of it. To be honest, we'd actually long done that task before the second time we picked it up, but sometimes an experience isn't about depth or abundance of content, but rather a fun time that continues to deliver the entertainment even from a shallow package. And so that is why I want to share that experience with you today. Howdy. I'm Prakuza, and welcome to DevBox, where today I want to take a look at an old favorite title from the PS1 era that entertained me and my brothers for longer than it had any right to. In that case, let's give Dragonseeds some retro respect. Releasing in 1998, Dragonseeds is a PS1 game developed and published by Jaleco, with the likes of Hideki Ishikawa as the project lead and Hiroyasu Ichizaki as the lead designer. Some might recognize Ishikawa for his work on the Mega Man Legends series, as well as some of his work designing a decent amount of artwork for the Pokemon trading card game. Ichizaki's claim to fame is as a producer on the first Clock Tower game. Aside from that, few people on the development team are the big names you'd expect to find in some niche but cult-followed game. Granted, it's not like Dragonseeds or developer Jaleco really have all that heavy of a cult following these days. The development studio, founded in 1974 as the Japanese Leisure Company, which was then shortened to Jaleco, has unfortunately been defunct as of 2014 as its parent company, Game Yaro, filed for bankruptcy. A successor company titled City Connection Co., which derives its name from a previous Jaleco release, has since absorbed the IP rights of the previous company and has since been facilitating the port and re-release of several of its titles onto Steam or through other storefronts. However, in its heyday through the 80s and 90s, Jaleco was responsible for the development and distribution of dozens, if not literally hundreds, of games. Though the exact number is a bit difficult to fully hammer down since many of them were series that would have multiple developers over their lifetime, as well as many of these games being ported across multiple systems, with Jaleco working directly on many of those ports. Some of the most notable games from the developer would include titles like City Connect, which again would become the name of the company that would absorb their IPs, Bases Loaded, Exerion, Rushing Beat, and possibly most importantly of all, Idle Janshi Sushi Pie. What? Have you never heard of Idle Janshi Sushi Pie? The strip mahjong series with 15 entries, including a Switch re-release from 2022? No one else? Okay. Guess that's only me then. Well, as you might assume from this laundry list of titles, Jaleco was a rather prolific developer with a decent number of well-received titles under their name. However, few things from the studio were really groundbreaking or the best in their class. This was always a subsidiary developer that would either develop or port titles pioneered by others and rarely pushed the envelope themselves. That being said, Jaleco's games would range heavily in their reception, with some earning moderate critical acclaim and others getting dragged by critics for a lack of ingenuity or innovation. Meanwhile, the highest rated games with their name on it were often published by Jaleco rather than directly developed by them. A modern day equivalent of this might be Bandai Namco, whose best games are more often published by them rather than developed by them. Oh shit, they actually make Peak too. Maybe that comparison isn't one-to-one. As for the topic of today's focus, Dragonseeds was among many titles that would earn that lackluster reception, with comparisons to similar games that had come before reflecting poorly on the initial critical reception. Some obvious comparisons could be made to games like Pokemon, but honestly the more accurate similar title would be Monster Rancher, considering that both games had a bigger focus on breeding, raising, and battling individual creatures at a time rather than a team setting. Still, Dragonseeds would certainly fall behind in that respect, as the actual interactions with the game's creatures, in this case the dragons, would be considerably more limited than other comparative titles like Monster Rancher. But we've got a hot minute before we can talk about the actual gameplay. First, we need to look at the quality of the presentation for Dragonseeds is actually kind of all over the place. While the artwork done for the whole game is immaculate and works around both the advances and limitations of the PS1 in order to present Warm City and all of its various locations in a way that makes it seem like at least moderately believable as a real space, it's really a lack of variety that hampers the overall package from start to finish. For the most part, the presentation is done with a series of high-quality background renders, usually with a visual novel or talking head style of dialogue interactions. Alongside the backgrounds, each character also has a 2D portrait to indicate who the player is talking to. However, with the exception of two specific characters, pretty much every character will only ever be found in their one specific location. So it's more for visual flair and flavor than anything else. That being said, these portraits are very well made, and they even have the extra mile of having animations whenever they're talking. I mean, there's no voice acting or any other animations to show the characters reacting or conversing, but even the small level of extra detail is still appreciated, since it could have easily been nothing but static visuals with scrolling text, without most players really noticing what's missing. The second part of the game is where the quality of the presentation gets a little more mixed. Because while the models and animations of the dragons and their combat arena are interesting and varied, it's mostly the same few arena locations for every fight, with very little variety to speak of among these fights. However, what Dragonseeds lacks in arena variety, it certainly makes up for in the variety of the dragons that participate in each fight. There are a grand total of 8 different dragon types between Saurian, Winged, Wasp, Beetle, Crustacean, Natura, Evil, and Spirit. While each of these different dragon types has their own unique visual presentation, there are also subsets within each group that has their own visual differences, usually aligning with their elemental affinity. This can offer as simple differences as their colors, like with the Saurians either being red or blue dinosaurs in their baby form, to the ways that Natura dragons draw inspirations from different types of mythology and art styles. One of my personal favorites being the ones that clearly pull from Jomon pottery. The most prominent modern representation of this type of design can be found in the designs of the Sheikah and Guardian machinery in Zelda Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. Not gonna lie, while I didn't know the historical reference when playing Breath of the Wild for the first time, I always enjoyed recognizing the similar inspiration from the Natura dragons in Dragonseeds, which then turned into a deeper appreciation once I did begin to understand the cultural history. Later on, the super versions of each dragon expands the typing beyond the standard definition of a dragon to angels, fairies, and big-mouthed demons. But more on them in a bit, we're almost there. On the note of historical and cultural designs, I should also mention the weapons and shields that can be purchased at the item shops. These range from your expected weapons like daggers, gladiuses, axes, and even a lightsaber. Then, of course, there's my personal favorite weapon in the entire game, which made its way into the thumbnail, in fact, the 7 stars. This is actually an old bit of Prakuza lore that I've dropped in the last few videos, actually, but the 7-branch sword is my favorite historical weapon ever. Even if it was never reported to be used in combat by any soldiers or commanders, its history comes as a ceremonial weapon that was gifted from Korean leadership to the Empress of Japan in the 3rd century. Though much of that history is centered on mythology rather than actual historical record. It's an interesting historical artifact, and Dragonseeds is actually the first piece of Japanese media that introduced me to the concept of this weapon, and I've been obsessed with it ever since. It stands up there with the Killage and the Moonlight Greatsword among my favorite weapon designs of all time. In-game, however, it is one of many incredible weapon designs, and continues to show that so much effort went into the dragons and weapon variety, and that it's in these visual designs that the real depth of Dragonseeds can be found. As we come to the end of the presentation section, now is when I should talk about the music and otherwise sound design of the game, and there is a part of me that wants to criticize it for being pretty bare bones, like much of the design of the rest of the game, but it's honestly pretty stellar. The overall sound design, like the noises of the dragons themselves when they clash against each other, is a little more than serviceable. Some of the cries are plenty interesting. I especially love the sounds the crustacean babies make when they attack, intimidate, or get hit. The more I sit and listen to the sounds of the game, I really can't find any true complaints to be made here. It's good and bordering on great at times, and then we get to the music. I was ready to write off some of the music at first because we only hear a handful of songs throughout a single playthrough of the game, but I really can't find anything to criticize about the compositions of Dragonseeds. Honestly, from the basic sounds of the creatures in combat to the music that makes up each respective location, I not only can't find a single complaint to be made here, but there are some solid bangers among the score that I expect I'll be keeping on my playlist for some time. Sound designers Kenichi Arakawa and Ryo Yamazaki really outdid themselves with this one. So much of it creates this moody atmosphere that perfectly accompanies the visuals and locations that they're paired with, like the bombast of battle, especially in the baby and illegal fighting arenas. Or the dense mechanical beat of Ishuka's junk shop. A close call for my favorite song in the entire soundtrack, I must say. It's honestly a series of beats that sticks with you the longer you engage with it. And given how long it takes to get through a full playthrough, that can be a good long time. But that's the presentation, and while I could describe the visual and sound design as a step beyond good, better in a lot of ways than a lot of the forgettable titles from the time, it only fails to fully impress or hit 10 out of 10 status thanks to the high quality of contemporaries from around the same period. It's beautiful and has the hints of proper quality craft to it, without being a best in class on any one specific area, except maybe the music. Honestly, the biggest limiting factor surely comes from how little variety there actually is of the game. So if the presentation is pretty but a little shallow, enough to dull the overall impression even, then what about Dragonseeds has kept it in my mind for almost 30 years? Well, that has a lot to do with the... So, when it comes down to what makes Dragonseeds such a mainstay for the 3 people in the world like myself who actually enjoys this game, it's certainly the gameplay. In that case, how is the gameplay? I mean, it's okay. Well, let's go over it now and you can decide for yourself what you think of it from how I describe it. Granted, it's not like I can properly convey the game feel with only words and footage, so, if you've made it this far, maybe be prepared to give the game a try for yourself. Alright, well, to get into the gameplay, it comes in basically 3 flavors. Most of our time in the game is spent shopping, then there is training, and finally, there are the battles. Since the good stuff is in the combat, we'll save that for last. For now, let's talk about the shopping. This also comes in 2 flavors. Flavor 1 is good old-fashioned vanilla over at Nancy's shop. Here we can buy weapons and shields of various sizes. Ignore that the game calls them reflectors, they're shields. The different sizes are related to the current age of our dragons, with babies needing small weapons, adults needing medium, and seniors needing large weapons. It's also worth it to visit the shop periodically, since her selection changes with each visit, and unless you know you've got the best gear she offers, there's always a decent chance you'll get a decent upgrade if you come back at least once a day. On the other end of the shopping, there's also Ishuka's junk shop. This is an RNG shop that will periodically have a couple items for sale, which can include super-powered weapons and reflectors, buffs for the currently equipped gear, and even items that will directly upgrade our dragons. However, most of the time, Ishuka will have nothing, and you'll have mostly wasted your time. Although a visit to the junk shop does allow your dragon to rest, which will allow it to increase its HP. On the topic of increasing our dragon's stats, that brings us to the second most common place we'll find ourselves during the gameplay loop, especially during the earliest days of a dragon's life cycle, the training center. This one is a source of one of those critiques of comparison that Dragonseeds earned, as the training center is the only place where the player can make a direct effect on the dragon, and even then, it isn't through any type of interactions like feeding, petting, or any other ways that would imply building a connection between the player character and their dragon. Instead, all we can do is one of 3 different types of training, either a strength training that is based on a timed reflex minigame, a tile-themed version of the shell game, and a virtual fight against an identical dragon. These can improve your close quarters combat, special attack, and speed respectively. In this case, speed is closer to evasion, by the way. We'll see the utility of that specific attribute when we start getting into some of the fights. And that quickly brings us into the most common part of the game loop, fighting, either in tournaments or at Joker's Place. Starting with Joker's Place, this is somewhat of an underground illegal fight club for us to bet on our own bouts, where therefore we can earn massive rewards for winning a match, or lose drastically if we don't come out on top. Proper use of Joker's Place can actually get us basically infinite money after only about 4 or 5 fights, and all we need to do to refresh our money after we spend it is do another fight or 2. Unfortunately, Joker's Place doesn't go any deeper than a place to mill gold for wins though, as we aren't allowed to bet on other fights or watch AI-controlled bouts between 2 NPC Dragonsages. By now, you might have noticed that lack of depth, in fact, as most places only have 1 or 2 notes to say about them. The other place we can go to fight is the Battle Arena, where the main story bouts are held, and the quote-unquote official tournament is located. Progress through the game is generally marked through here, and for anything that unlocks as we play, it is by winning the A-rank tournaments at each level there, specifically the Baby, Junior, and Fighter tiers. This is how we unlock certain dragon forms like Spirit and Evil, which aren't available to us right at the start. While we're here, we can honestly jump directly to the A-rank matches for each tier and move directly on to the next level immediately, but these can be extremely difficult, even when using an adult dragon against the baby tier of fighters. So it's usually better to go up the ranks in regular order, as each fight will make your dragon stronger for each bout they compete in. Before we move on to exactly how those fights happen, there are 2 other locations that we should cover real quick: the Clone Lab and the Memory Forest. These are places you'll only really visit either after a dragon dies in combat, or much later in the game when looking to quickly grab a new dragon as an optional replacement in case your current dragon dies. One fun note about the Memory Forest, it actually earns its name from the fact that it directly reads the memory card in the second slot of the PlayStation in order to generate specific dragons. Like the Gundam-looking dude named Stamina that I got as a result of having Final Fantasy Tactics data saved into the second slot. Look out for a retro respect on that game in June, by the way. Really excited for that one. As for the Clone Lab, this is where we specifically clone and store our dragons, which is important at the start of the game and only ever comes up again if you want to grab more dragon types or need to replace your main if they die and you don't want to engage in a little save scumming in order to turn back the clock on your failures. However, with all of that out of the way, we can get to the part you're probably really interested in: the combat. The center of the gameplay that every other aspect of the game has been feeding directly into up until now. So, combat takes the form of a simplified side-scrolling fighter. It comes off as a bit of a combination between Pokemon and Street Fighter, but with a much narrower set of options for how to act in each fight. The fights themselves are turn-based, where the player and their opponent selects 2 actions to take each round, and both dragons will then enact those choices in sequence. For example, if you wanted to move into close range and then attack with a melee weapon, you'd press up on the D-pad in order to approach the opponent, then press circle in order to do the melee attack, which comes out as a blade beam that the dragon launches from their equipped weapons. The 6 options for what to do in each turn are move forward, move backwards, melee attack, special attack, defend, and finally, intimidate. Move forward and back are pretty obvious, but they tie directly into the build of the arena. There are 3 different distances that 2 fighting dragons can be at any given time, either close range, mid-range, or long range. At close range, dragons can melee attack each other, and they can use special attacks at any range. So adjusting for the range yourself and accounting for how the opposing dragon will move in and out of range at any given time is a huge part of the strategy from fight to fight. For example, if it's clear that you can win by staying in melee range and attacking on repeat, you may need to adjust for the fact that the opposing dragon will likely back out to the middle distance and then special attack, while you flail helplessly from too far away to stop it. As for the 2 attack types, melee once again can only be done at short range, but it also has the benefit of being faster than the special attack. So if one dragon manages to close the distance and then use a melee attack, while the opponent attempts to special attack, the melee will always deal damage and cancel out that special. The special attack, however, can be used at range and in general is much stronger than most melee attacks have the potential to be. There is also a limited number of times that any dragon can use these special attacks, so using them recklessly can leave a dragon somewhat exposed at a distance, forcing one fighter to have to break that distance in order to keep the pressure on, which can be dangerous if they don't know how many more ranged special attacks their opponent can continue to throw out while trying to approach. Special attacks also have an element assigned to them by the element of the dragon using them, and there's a bit of a rock, paper, scissors effect with these elements that can make some fights easier or harder, since different elements will be weak or strong against their opposing elements. However, it's not too noticeable in actual gameplay, and for the most part, it really only affects the color of the special attacks and maybe adds a small positive and negative modifier in the background of the damage calculations. There are also two ways to mitigate any damage taken. The first is through the speed stat, which gives a certain chance for whichever dragon is faster to be able to dodge certain oncoming attacks. These can be both special attacks and melee hits. However, this is mostly RNG dependent and not the type of thing players will want to be overly reliant on, even if it can turn the tide of a fight if it triggers in a pinch. The second way to mitigate damage is by using the shield or reflector in order to guard oncoming special attacks. This won't do anything to melee attacks, but if you block a special attack, you can actually redirect it back at the enemy, hence shields being called reflectors in this game. Small reflectors tend to only launch back the attack at about half damage, and can only reflect 2 or 3 times before they stop redirecting the hits. However, even if they don't redirect an attack, they will still nullify any damage from an oncoming special attack. So they can still be useful to keep from taking unnecessary hits at range, especially if you're looking to run out the clock for whatever reason. Finally, we have Intimidate, which will slightly raise a dragon's attack for the duration of the fight. I would tell you which button it's mapped to, but I honestly never used it and don't remember. Don't get me wrong, as any Pokemon fan familiar with the competitive scene or challenge content might know, the ability to raise your stats or lower your opponents during a fight can be make or break in some battles. However, measuring distance, properly reflecting shots, and landing your own special attacks becomes so much more important across fights that intimidating is really a minor part of the total tactics of the game, since there are rarely opportunities to 1 or 2 shot an enemy the same way you might in Pokemon. The slight boosts in strength from intimidating is a much more compounding effect that can be quickly overcome by getting blasted in the face with a couple special attacks. Now that we know the basics of combat, each fight is a 2-minute bout between 2 dragons, every time. There's no twist on this formula at any point, and the AI can often be dumb enough to bait into attacking constantly, and then leave itself open for receiving tons of special attacks right to the face. That being said, these fights aren't always easy, and it is very likely that they won't end in the player's favor every time. Of course, this in and of itself can have multiple results. Obviously, players can win the fight, but if they lose, it can either be lost in a surrender, opting to stop fighting before your dragon drops to 0 HP. It can be lost due to time. Whichever dragon has the most HP once the timer hits 0 will be announced the winner, so it's still possible to lose without dying. But worst of all options is to drop to 0 HP, which will kill a dragon outright. Yeah, this isn't a Pokemon-style battler with monsters fainting if they're brought down to 0. They die and are dead for good, meaning that a death is a full reset back to the cloning lab to make a new dragon and start over again. This also deletes the dragon's currently equipped weapon and shield, meaning that you could be restarting at a major loss, since you'll be down what was probably your most powerful gear. I'd argue that this is actually the closest the game comes to giving the player the chance to bond with their dragon, with the permadeath having a similar effect to a Nuzlocke run in Pokemon, where the added stakes due to each creature's potential frailty makes losses hit harder and wins more triumphant. Of course, in Dragonseeds, you can always reload a save and try the fight over again if you don't want to deal with the consequences, but that's a choice to be made from player to player. Aside from the permadeath, the gameplay really does earn itself some of that negative association when comparing it for the ability to breed and raise monsters, since these dragons don't really have much in the way of a personality outside of combat, and there is no real interaction to be made outside of ordering it to attack. None of the dragons feel like they have any sense of personal agency, and the distance created between the player character and the dragon as a pet only further lowers the bond between player and monster. That being said, there is at least a reason to train up these dragons into capable fighters, because there are 2 different arenas to take them through. The first is obviously the battle arena, where the story takes place, but the second might be the more important during this era of gaming. If 2 people have saved their games on different memory cards, then they can both plug into the same PlayStation and actually fight their dragons against each other. These fights won't ever end in a dragon dying permanently, however, these can have some stakes attached to them, as players can wager in-game currency, equipment, or even other dragons in each bout, and when a winner is declared, they'll keep whatever was left in the pot before the fight started. This could arguably be seen as the main reason for the whole game existing, to be honest, as the game appears to be specifically built for these types of one-on-one competitions. A good fight makes for a great test of player skill and strategy against each other, but it also can show who's the better dragon sage in-game, as a better raised dragon can give a massive advantage during these multiplayer fights. It's a bit of a step past grabbing your favorite character in Street Fighter II Alpha Turbo Special Edition and duking it out between Dudley and Guile. Having actually raised your own dragon puts its own layer of stakes on the fight. That being said, we can't really talk about the reasons to raise dragons without going over the main draw of any game. So, the story opens up with a bit of exposition about the world and how Warm City came to be known as the center of dragon raising and competition. As stated by the opening title crawl, in the distant year of Sela 180, a different era of humans on Earth, the ice caps have almost completely melted on the North and South Poles, which has flooded most of the world. However, as the snow and ice clears, a 90-million-year-old creature is uncovered, and scientists rush to study the preserved corpse. After much study, biologists manage to clone the creature from its DNA, creating what becomes known as dragons. And a city springs up in the location where dragon cloning and eventually a dragon arena would arise, drawing in travelers from across the world to see these mighty creatures and begin their new lives as dragon sages. Upon starting up a new game, we arrive to Warm City and are greeted by a city guard, who guides us to the cloning lab and sets us up with a starting dragon, a little Saurian. From here, we are quickly found by Awazanak, the current reigning champion of the World Dragon Council. He challenges us to the tutorial fight and promptly kills our starting dragon, forcing us to learn the lesson about what happens when a dragon falls in battle right away. Now, there is no way to win this match, as Awazanak's dragon simply has too high of numbers for us to ever compete. But if you're curious about whether or not you could actually survive this encounter, well, you're in luck, because there is a companion video to this one on the channel, asking and answering that very question. Feel free to go check it out now, or when you finish here. I'm trying something new to see if I can't get the old YouTube algorithm to actually benefit a Retro Respect for once, since these are actually my favorite videos to do. I love talking about retro titles and want my channel to be about celebrating all aspects of this art form. So do me a favor and go watch, like, comment, all the YouTube-y stuff for both of these videos so I can keep making more content like this. Anyway, after we've had our first dragon mercilessly slaughtered by Awazanak, our next steps are to head to the clone lab again, only this time we can actually make some decisions about the dragon we'll make. In this case, let's make our little Lambo a Natura, because I want to show off that Jonan pottery style of dragon. Oh, and that name is because this is absolutely our sacrificial first dragon, who will likely die while trying to climb to the top, or at least while earning me the money to attempt to reach the top. And we'll probably be replacing him before he even manages to graduate from baby form. From here, we can also spend the day meeting everyone across the whole town, although without a dragon accompanying us, we can't really do anything. But everyone will at least introduce themselves to us, and we can grab a starting weapon and shield for the dragon we have growing in the nursery. The next day, we can pick up Lambo and start working on some of his training and getting him acclimated to the battle arena. Wow, that was way faster than I thought it would be. Probably should have surrendered if I saw the fight going out of control like that. Well, that goes to show that hoping for good RNG will most likely get us killed. Whoops, let's try this again. And we'll name our new dragon, Winged, after the sentiment the last one left us with. Okay, from here we can actually start to really get some fights in, and head to the training center for some early boosts in special attack and muscle. Now, let's take on the baby division. As we continue to work our way through this tier of the tournament, we'll also take a brief detour to Joker's Place in order to start doing the underground matches for much higher payouts. Specifically, once we have 1,000 or more gold, we can start betting everything we've got and double our money each time, up to a total of 9,000 per fight. This will give us the cash we need to buy pretty much everything we can ever want for the rest of the game. Then, Whoops grows into his adult form. This is the size for the junior division, but we'll have to clear out the baby tier before we can move on up to that. So let's earn that baby A-rank trophy. Then rinse and repeat through all of the junior tier until we have a matching A-rank trophy for junior. One more trip into the cocoon will level Whoops up to a senior dragon, which gets us ready for the final stages of his life. Once we hit an age of 30, we'll be getting into the end of Whoops' life cycle, and he could potentially die a few days after that. So it's a race to the finish to getting through the fighter tier of the battle arena, and then the final 5 fights. In fighter tier, we fight some other senior level dragons and make our way quickly through to the A rank, before we can get to the finale, the WDC, or the World Dragon Council division. These final 5 fights will be one-on-ones with the top 5 dragons in the whole city, all of which are some form of either seniors, mutants, or super dragons. These include angels, demons, and even that Gundam guy we saw earlier. The penultimate fight is against the guard who first greeted us when we got to Worm City. It's like any other fight, except his dragon is really strong. Then, we finally get our rematch against Awazanek, the bastard who killed our starting dragon all those few minutes ago. It's actually been like 10 hours of gameplay for me, but we're only focusing on the story here. Once we beat Awazanek, we're named the champion and we're given the credits. Yep, that's it. Awazanek complains that he can't believe he got defeated and the game is over. From here, though, we can continue to play for as long as we want, and we can even reach the championship match multiple times over with new dragons each time, adding each new dragon's name to our trophy whenever we do. Oh, and if we go back to the battle arena with a champion, we can defend our championship from competitors that have also fought their way up through the ranks like we did. Now, you may have noticed something about the story at this point. There wasn't one, which is why I didn't even bother to include a spoiler warning. There's really nothing to even get spoiled on. In that case, let's wrap this up in the... So, Dragonseeds. Does it hold up? Is it worth a play now, almost 30 years after its release? Do I still think it's as great as I did back when I played it as a kid? I mean, those are really harder questions to answer than they seem. Because while the story is basically missing, and some aspects of the game are completely bare bones, such as actually bonding with your dragon, and others are completely frustrating in many cases, like I didn't focus on the training arena much, but it is very exact with the timing on that muscle training exercise, and the glorified cup game basically requires hijacking your own brain to save the image in its own short-term backup. It's not the best system, if I'm being completely honest. So then, everything hangs on the combat. And I'd say, yeah, these absolutely hold up. For how implicitly simple the fighting is, with only having 6 options for actions to choose between each turn, the level of strategy that can be pulled from it is remarkably deep. Between trying to properly time special attacks to actually hit your opponent and not simply get reflected back at you, to maintaining aggression and momentum in the close range when you have the advantage, the depth to be found is in how you use these tools, not in how many tools there are. Hell, if I went toe-to-toe with someone who knew what they were doing and how to properly charge up some intimidates before hammering on some hits, I probably wouldn't even last the full 2 minutes, even with a more powerful dragon to use. It's a puddle, only about wide enough for 2 people to jump in, but centered on a hole that we can drop miles down into if we really get into it. That being said, the lack of a story is a bit of a disappointment in a few ways. For one, very little is done about the fact that Worm City is somewhere in a post-apocalyptic Antarctica. Literally, from the opening shot, you can see the Antarctic Peninsula, and we'd already been told that the ice caps had melted, which is why we see buildings submerged off the shore from the main city view. You could always argue that this is because it's a pretty early PS1 title, and maybe we shouldn't expect too much story from a game like this. But this came out a year after Final Fantasy VII, and alongside Jade Cocoon, another creature battler that intertwines its own apocalypse story directly into the gameplay. So, I don't know if I'd say that Dragonseeds necessarily holds up as an entire package, but I can say that jumping into the game every few years, as I have since 1998, continues to be as fun now as it was back then. And I still absolutely adore training these dragons, even if the game shows little effort in trying to get me to engage with them. Still, sometimes love comes naturally, and if you do decide to give Dragonseeds a try, I hope you see what I mean there, and are able to find it in those depths that this game does manage to offer. Hey, it's that time again. The end of the video where I invite folks to come check out the Patreon. Link in the description, and make good on the rewards for those currently pledged. Patreon members get early access to new content and their names written in the credits at the end of videos. And those who pledge in the top tiers get their names read out, like our DevBox designers, Genghis Braun, and our DevBox developers, Azul. Thanks for the support, and thanks for watching.